Hi, so today we have with us Gautam Bhatia, who's edited Between Worlds, the If Anthology of New Indian Speculative and Fantasy Fiction, Volume 1. Now, in the introduction, hi, Gautam.
Hi, hi.
Now, in the introduction, you say like they're going to be that this is Volume 1 and there's going to be many more. So, you want to talk about that first to begin with? Why there are going to be many more and how and all that before we launch into it?
Yeah, I mean, so volume two is already in process. The submissions call opened a couple of weeks ago, and so anyone who's listening and wants to submit their story, they can find the submissions call online, and we are going till the end of February. So March 1st is the deadline for volume two. Now, why a series? Well, a couple of reasons. One is that if you want to have a literary infrastructure around genre fiction, then anthologies are one important ingredient of that.
Mm, mm,
So, imprints, conventions, reviews, anthologies, they all go into creating like a culture where there is space for both writers and readers to explore the genre. And secondly, I think that they are a great way of platforming new writers. So we had a situation where in volume one, half the writers in the anthology, this was their first professional sale. By that I mean that a sale to a paying venue, a venue that pays
mm,
for your words.
mm,
And so that was a matter of great pride for us, and we thought it would be nice to try and do that again and try and make this a recurring feature where new writers can see this as a viable pathway to entering the writing space, the publishing space.
mm. But tell me, I mean, you've written a couple of books in this genre yourself, and but what is it? What is it that attracts you to it? And and then the anthology. What did you look for in the submissions? But first, tell us about your own affinity towards the genre.
I mean, I've been really involved in it since I was a very, very young kid. Most genre writers start off as being readers and fans, and then often writing fan fiction, and then getting into writing or creating their own works. And to me, what always drew me to the genre was just the imaginative possibilities it offers you, and by letting you change a few things about the world you're creating that are different from the world that we live in, that then lets you shine a light back onto our world. So for me,
Mm,
a lot of the best science fiction is science fiction that just shifts a little bit. It creates a world where which is quite familiar, but a couple of things are just shifted a little bit, and then that illustrates the contingency of many of the foundational pillars of our world. And
mm,
also, I mean, as a reader, I love reading space opera because that gives you this sense of awe and wonder about the vastness of both space and time, and how tiny we are, in comparison, and that's always, I think, a very wonderful feeling to experience while reading. That sense of grandeur, that sense of space that science fiction gives you. So that's always been what has attracted me to the genre. Now, I mean, in this anthology, I try not to let those biases determine what finally makes it. So we were looking for good speculative fiction stories, which could be science fiction, could be fantasy, could be magical realism, could be horror, could be anything that broadly falls within the understanding of speculative fiction. And of course, we had a few things that we said would be tough sells. Things that
mm,
we've been seeing for a long time, outworn tropes, zombies, vampires, werewolves, things like that. Uh,
mm,
Tropes that would lend themselves to just in large part imitations of Western works. You don't really want to see that, and of course that
mm,
doesn't mean that you can't have original work in that. So we're not saying that there is no chance, but it'll
Mm.
just be a hard sell. And that we put that on our submissions call. We repeated that this year, and some people have not been very happy about that. But again, we got 230 submissions last time to read, uh,
Mm.
and I read all of them, shortlisted 30, and then me and the Westland editorial staff picked the final shortlist. So we also need to just have certain things we don't want just to make the volume manageable. So if I
Mm.
get like 50 vampire stories, there might be one brilliant vampire story, but I don't want to read 50 vampire stories to pick that one, amazing vampire story. So yeah, we had some things we said might be hard sells if you submit those, and for the rest, very ecumenical. And so again, in the anthology, I am partial towards science fiction and space opera, but we have, I think, just one actual semi-space opera and a lot of non-science, spec.
Yes.
It could be fantasy, it could be a bit of historical fiction, perhaps,
Mm.
some dystopia. Although I'm not a fan of dystopia, but we have dystopic stories because they were the good stories. So in
Mm.
that way, it's that it does showcase, I think, the breadth of the genre as well. The stories we have in the anthology.
Mm. And like while I was reading it, I was thinking that a lot of them deal with our current preoccupations in
Yeah,
a about mind control, really,
yeah,
right? And about how the world is being projected by forces that we have no control over,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So you want to talk about that? I found
Yeah,
that very good. I mean, I found that interesting, really.
yeah, I mean, so science fiction and spec fic in general has always been responding to the times.
Mm.
1930s, there was the era of tech optimism, and so a lot of the stories from that era, which was maybe the foundational era of modern science fiction, although of course, arguably the first modern science fiction story is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. That's normally accepted to
Yes,
be the
yes,
first modern story, although of course people will argue about this, a lot.
yeah.
But 1930s is when you see perhaps the explosion of the genre, and so there's a lot of like tech optimism, a lot of like belief that the advance of science will solve many problems. In the 1950s, you have post World War II. A lot of stories then deal with the nuclear threat the threat of nuclear war. First contact, space exploration. Then the 1960s, you have this whole sexual revolution awakening in many countries, and then you have new wave, science fiction that deals with exploring the boundaries of sexuality, of
Mm.
gender, and so on. So this genre has always been about responding to the preoccupations of the time,
Mm.
and just given the times we live in and the multiple upheavals, the climate catastrophe, the genocide, all of that, you would expect stories to be responding to those events using the speculative route. So in that sense, I think it just follows an old tradition of this genre being always responsive to some of the major issues that the world is confronting at any given time.
Yes. No, but while I was reading it, I was also feeling a sort of like sadness that,
Yeah,
that we can't ever be so optimistic now like
yeah,
they were in the early days of science fiction, right? I
yeah,
mean, like when one was a child, you read those early
yeah,
works and they were all about, the
yeah,
fantastic future ahead. And now
yeah.
we reached a point where it's no longer like that. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, so you do have utopian science fiction still being written, and you do have what you may call optimistic science fiction. A lot of that is set far in the future, like very, very far in the future. And some of it, which is again not utopian, but for example, Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future is
Mm.
still optimistic science fiction that illustrates perhaps a certain kind of way outside of the climate, outside a certain kind of way to resolve the climate crisis. But that is very technical, again, science fiction. I just think for whatever reason we didn't have those stories in the submission in the first round. I don't think they're not being written,
Mm.
but I think for whatever reason those weren't among the ones that made it to our shortlist and to the final table of contents. It is interesting though because one of the things I do, I run a science fiction book club in Delhi, and it's been going on for 3 years now. And
Mm.
back in 2022, when I started it along with a colleague, we had this thing where we had a Google Doc to gauge interest. And one thing that we asked people to respond to was the question of like what subgenre of science fiction are you most interested to read in this book club? And by far the majority wanted dystopia and or climate fiction. So I think that that also perhaps tells you that Indian writers and readers, for again for very understandable reasons, are in quite a dystopic frame of mind right now. So that might be part of it. I don't know.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. So, how long did you guys work on this? I mean, like, just break down like when you decided, okay, we need to do this, and then
Yeah.
the final wrap.
Yeah, I mean, it began with in conversations with Westland, with Kartika and Ajita, who are the editorial staff, and they began this imprint called If, which is the first English language Indian spec fic imprint,
Hmm.
which is very important because in the West, every major publishing house has a speculative fiction imprint. That's why it's big. Whereas here we
Hmm.
never had that. It's always the poor cousin, right? And when they began the imprint, we were just talking, and the idea of this annual anthology came up, and we thought it was something worth doing. Then we had a call for submissions in summer of last year, and we gave around 4 months people to respond to it, to write, and we had submissions coming in until mid-October. And
Oh,
one thing that we
October.
mid-October, yeah. So it was a 4 month period, window period. So if somebody had like something ready, send it in. If you're beginning from scratch, you have 4 months to write like a story, right? So
Hmm.
enough time to do something from scratch. And then so then one thing we did was that we wanted to avoid any kind of gatekeeping because genre fiction is first of all a very gatekept genre, but also the Indian literary establishment is extremely gatekept, right? Like this is a very tiny clique of people, and it's all about like who you know and who can put you on like awards lists and who can invite you to like lit fest. It's all very very incestuous. And we didn't want to replicate that. So what we did was we followed the academic model of a blind peer review. So we said that remove your identifying information from the story, and send the story in along with a separate document telling us who you are, to the editorial staff, and then they would send to me just the actual story. So I would not know who the author was, and so there would be no possibility of me being influenced by this person being my friend or being a big name, or just somebody well known who I don't want to offend by rejecting the story, because at some point they may be on an awards jury, so there's no possibility of any kind of thing. I don't know who the author is. Now, does this remove all kinds of bias? No, I mean, obviously not. Like my positionality and my upbringing and my own privileges obviously will, play a part in the kinds of stories that speak to me. And also, honestly, I mean, if you're someone who's been to a writing workshop or have had constructive beta readers read your work and give you feedback, the story you send in will just be as a matter of craft better. So those kinds of biases, you can't eliminate entirely, but you can eliminate the most obvious one, which is that publishing my friends, in my anthology. So we did that, and then I got these 230, anonymous stories, which were I think around 200 short stories and 30 novelettes. I read them next 2 or 3 months. I brought them down to a short list of 30 pieces. And then the second round was the three of us together. And here we de anonymized the shortlist because we didn't want, for example, end up with a TOC which is so unrepresentative of just the writing community, right? So you don't want to have all men or all like people from Delhi, right? Something of that kind.
Hmm.
Yeah. So the second round, then we de-anonymized the submissions, the top 30, because we didn't want a situation where the final TOC would be completely unrepresentative of the diversity of the writing community. So it shouldn't end up being, all men or,
Yeah.
like all North Indian, people, so stuff like that. We actually, it was quite okay because it so
So
turned
one sec. At
with
this point, I have to say that there seems to be like quite a few Tamil writers.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's right. So there was it ended up being a fairly, I think, equitable distribution across genders and across regions. And of course, we would have liked for it to also be more equitable across religions and caste, which
Mhm.
didn't happen. Hopefully, as we go on, that can be something we can improve on. And we also did have a translation. We had a space for translated fiction. So the requirement was that, like, send us the original story with a summary that's there in English. And we did
Hmm.
get 3 or 4 submissions, but hopefully that will become something again more established as we go on. So I think part of the reason for having this as a recurring series is also that as we go on, as the series hopefully becomes more established, as it becomes a reference point, people who otherwise may be reluctant to submit their work would think of us as a venue where they can submit their work. So that was the next step. Then we whittled down the 30 to finally the selected stories, the 11 in the TOC. We then had one round of edits with the writers, a second round with a copy editor, Sanjana, and then finally it went to print. So the whole process took around from the submissions call to publication was just over a year, the entire
Okay.
process. Yeah.
Okay. So now you're already on the second one. So,
Yeah, we opened the submissions call mid-December. And
mm,
so we are in the submissions period for the second one now.
okay, and you've already started getting responses, or
Again, so I wouldn't know that yet because they don't come to me.
oh yeah, yeah.
So I will ask for them maybe tomorrow, first Jan, because it's always easier to read as you go and not then have the whole flood descending on you on the final day. But it doesn't really help because I think last time 70% of the people submitted their work on the final day. So so there still will be a flood at the end, but I will try and read also as we go. Those who do submit their work, I'll read as we go.
It sounds, it is, I'm sure, a tough job.
It's enjoyable. I mean, it is work. It is a lot of work, but it is enjoyable work. And the feeling of seeing this volume come together, and I think just seeing that. I think for me the nicest thing was we had a launch event at Champaka in Bangalore in
Hmm.
a couple of months ago, and we did this model which I saw the Blaft anthology of anti-caste
Hmm.
SF had done, which is that the writers from that city or nearby and the editor would be in conversation. And one thing that more than one person said, more than one writer said at the panel, was that actually having your story picked in a blind review scenario where you know that your name has played no role either way is
Hmm.
a really fantastic feeling of validation. And also, I think that was nice to
Yes.
hear. And also, just like the number of people for whom it was their first professional sale was very, very nice to experience. I think that sort of thing really makes it worth it and makes the effort worth the while.
But going forward, do you think, are you thinking of things like, conventions and, really events which are really focused on this area, which is required, right?
It is, but the conventions can't ever be the job of one person. For that, you need to have a community, right? And I think
Yes.
like the phase we're in right now is the phase of, in a certain way, creating that community. Uh,
Mm.
so what things like anthologies do, or Indian writers achieving success by getting foreign book deals, being on award shortlists, winning awards and imprints. So all of this is the first step towards creating that community, which will then coalesce around things like conventions. The next step is something like conventions. How close or how far away we are from that, I'm not sure. Uh, but I think there is still a way to go because when you enter Indian bookshops, you'll see the genre fiction stuff buried away somewhere far at the back. You
Mm.
wouldn't see Indian spec fic writers being displayed. The only exception to this is Champaka, which has a shelf of Indian specific writers, right there, both in their Indira Nagar and their Vasant Nagar outlets. So I mean, they're the only bookshop that actually has literally like a shelf space dedicated to, and there you can find pretty much all the English language writers who have published last decade or so. No other bookshop I've seen has that, and you go in, you just say, either it won't be there, the books won't be there, or they'll be somewhere deep, dark, where nobody can see them. So the discoverability is impossible unless you go into a bookshop saying, "I want this book because I came across it, elsewhere." You wouldn't
Mm.
find these books just by browsing. So I think things like that still show you that there is a bit of a way to go in terms of getting to a point where conventions are a common part of the writing calendar. I think what has changed is that you now have panels on elements of spec-fic in many of the major literary festivals, which you
Mm.
didn't have even 3 or 4 years ago. They do have an annoying habit of putting the SF writers on AI panels, but even that's something. It's better than not having it at all. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So, when I was reading this and uh, I was thinking that, because they're by Indian writers, of course, we have many cultures, but
yeah,
uh, there's an Indian, I mean, there's a specific tone and there's a specific, like, I mean, you get it, right? And one isn't saying that one doesn't get science fiction or
yeah.
speculative fiction, international writers, but there really is a difference. So, according to you, what do you think it is? And so that's why I enjoyed reading this. Suddenly
Yeah.
one feels like, okay,
Yeah.
there's feeling of, you know
Yeah, I think like it has a lot to do with the very unique hybrid cultural environment in which many of us have come of age.
hmm,
Which is to say that on the one hand, of course, you know, those of us who grew up in English-speaking homes with a certain degree of economic and social privilege
hmm,
have always been exposed to the major cultural signposts of the Western world.
yes,
Growing up, for me, it would have been Harry Potter, like a major reference point.
hmm,
Lord of the Rings in fantasy fiction, right?
yes,
And Asimov and Clarke and all of that in science fiction. These
yeah,
are writers I may not go back to now for a variety of reasons.
yes,
From like
hmm.
bad politics to like bad writing,
Yeah,
but it was very much you were part of and are a part of a more international conversation on the one hand, but
yeah,
also, of course, just by osmosis, the Indian myths, whichever myth is prominent in the milieu you're from, those kinds of reference points are also part of your coming of age.
yeah,
Of course, I think something as basic as the names, you know, in a story, uh,
yeah,
will convey a sense of home.
yes,
And so I think like a combination of those things is what would make a story sound distinctively Indian. There is, I think, a certain historical experience that we've had as Indians, a certain belonging to multiple different worlds, without necessarily being fully at home in any of them, and just writing about people that we know
hmm,
that would then I think give these stories the sense of being Indian. I don't think thematically there's any like distinctively Indian theme there because
hmm,
like Indians can write Star Trek, right? So there's
yeah,
no bar over there. But it's just that yeah, like we've grown up in what is in some way a common milieu. Uh,
yes, yeah, and then the references to caste or
yeah,
the change in caste relationships
yeah,
over generations, those sort of things I really found, and also
yeah,
like the totalitarian state or the feeling of the Delhi story, especially.
yeah.
What is it called? Delhi
Delhi circa 50 something.
TNE,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right?
Yeah, no,
That
I think that, yeah, I think like, well, so caste for sure. I think the very specific forms patriarchy takes in South Asia in general.
yes.
And I think again, yeah, like you're right in that whereas authoritarian states are a common feature of the world, there
Hmm.
is a very specific pathology of authoritarianism that has taken root in a place like India, or I think more broadly in South Asia. In fact, I remember that a couple of years ago for Himal magazine, I did this long piece on Sri Lankan genre fiction. One part of which was exploring Vajra Chandrasekhara's The Saint of
Mm,
Bangalore, which was a book that won a bunch of awards,
mm,
published a couple of years ago. And
yes.
one thing that struck me was that there is a very specific kind of almost petty authoritarian, governance mode of just the very low level harassment, and just like again like just the um, physical like beatings that you might get, but not like something at a very high level, but just like as
Yeah,
daily occurrence, right? So this sort of
yeah.
micro authoritarian governance that then of course feeds into a broader project is, I think, something that is very distinctively South Asian in its flavor. And again, I
Mm,
think the stories in the anthology, some of them give you a taste of that very distinctively South Asian flavor of authoritarian, governance. So I
mm.
think you have a bit of that.
Yeah, and also this story, I think the one where the middle-aged woman uh, who kind of comes into her own. Is it between? No, it's the a rough-edged
Tough edge
confection.
confection. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
I thought that's like a perfect story of menopause, actually.
yeah.
you
Yeah,
know,
I mean, yeah,
rebellion at that stage in life.
yeah,
But it's presented through, I don't know, her memories of myth and
yeah,
everything. So it gives it many more levels.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah.
So, so all these things, I found that quite interesting, and something that one doesn't find in Western, maybe anthologies that one has read or fiction, because
Yeah,
I.
I think that like modern Western SF has paved the way for, I think, some very subtle and interesting explorations of gender, and sexuality and
Mm,
so on.
mm,
But of course, you're completely right in that there are specific forms that patriarchy takes here, um,
mm,
and stories written from here would be informed by those forms.
yeah.
You can see a common thread between the explorations in Indian anthology and elsewhere, but there is that distinctively Indian flavor again coming from just that lived experience. Uh,
Mm. So I wondered, like like how we get, because we've been exposed to it, we
yeah,
get Western science fiction. Would they get our science fiction, our speculative fiction? Would they get it? Because there's so many layers which only somebody who is within this cultural milieu
yeah,
gets, right?
yeah.
Unspoken.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting point, and I think this taps into this long-standing debate in modern genre fiction, which is to say that in many ways the so-called, I mean, Western world has achieved a kind of cultural hegemony, right? So
Yeah,
when you
yeah.
read a book like, say, China Miéville's Un London, right, which is
Yes, yes.
or King Rat, you
Hmm.
know those signposts. Like all of us have a map of London in our heads, right? So we know,
Yes.
like we know if someone mentions, some landmark of London, we know what it is. Uh,
Yeah.
and it's really interesting because so I've been a reviewer of genre. I've stopped now since I've become a writer myself, but I spent a decade reviewing genre fiction very very frequently. And
Hmm.
one book I reviewed, I think around 5 years ago, was this Nigerian writer Sui Davies Okungba's debut novel called David Mogo God Hunter, which is set
Hmm.
in modern day Nairobi. And it refers to all of these landmarks of Nairobi. And I had to basically open a map of Nairobi when I was reading that book, because when you
Hmm.
say like the triple bridge, what's the image of that, right? So as opposed to Buckingham Palace, right? So
Yeah.
so I did like and it really added, so because obviously like he wasn't going to explain because he shouldn't, right?
Yeah.
It's on the reader then to say, okay, I will sit with an atlas next to me and just like cross reference so I can get a visual image of the events of this novel. And I think like what you're seeing now is a growing realization amongst the at least the dedicated Western readers, that this is their responsibility. So they have to actually make the effort to acquaint themselves with the milieu of a particular story or a novel. Of course, it'll never be perfect, But what I do see is that willingness to make the effort. So, for example, this anthology was reviewed very favorably in Locus magazine, which is the predominant US genre fiction magazine.
Yeah.
And there was a fantastic review. Of course, there was critique, and there was also praise, and I should be the case of the review. And of course, an anthology has to be like, people will like or dislike different stories, but there was an engagement with what was going on. And I think that, I think again, there's a long way to go, because the default is very much, London, New York, those kinds of places as settings. Um, and of course the preoccupations, of the people there. So I think that's still very much the default, and that will remain the default for the foreseeable future, because that's where publishing power is, right?
Yeah.
So ultimately you have to convince a US or a UK literary agent and a US or a UK publisher that this is worth, publishing, if you want to really have a global audience. So I think that will remain. I do see, however, that it's changing in a way that it wasn't earlier. So there is much more
Mm.
openness to engaging with non-Western SF on its own terms. The explosion of Chinese science fiction has played a part in that for sure. Uh,
Mm.
the explosion of Afrofuturism, I think, again, has played a big part in that. And yeah, like, so, I mean, a couple of years ago, there was this whole debate about italicizing certain words, right? So
Yes,
if I
yes.
say sari or roti, do I have to italicize them to show that this is a different language word in an English language
Mm.
story? And the
Mm.
consensus was that no, I mean, this is as much a part of English now, as is any other word, because English is not the preserve of the West. It's very much the language of the colonies, for
Yes.
or worse, right? So most writers do not, writers writing from African countries, or Indian writers will not italicize specific words, but they'll just be there, and then it's up to the reader to make the effort. Just recently, I was reading Bora Chung's
Mm.
book, because we have a conversation on 10th of Jan as part of a
Okay.
Korea India exchange, uh,
Mm.
and um, and in the first story, there's reference to the word Sunbae, Sunbae. I had no
Mm.
idea, what is this word. And so finally, I had to go and Google it, and it's your senior colleague. But there was no italics, nothing. It was just there, like, as if you were saying colleague. So I
Mm.
think that's you see a lot more of that now in writing from outside of the US and the UK, which is clearly on its own terms, and expecting the reader to make the effort then to come and meet you where you are.
Yeah. I often wondered, why we don't have the same attitude towards Australian and Canadian writing. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in terms of at least genre fiction, it's because it is much less prominent in Australia and Canada than it is in the US and the UK. You do
mm.
have Canadian science fiction writers, of course, and
Mm.
you do have Australian writers, many of whom are my friends, because I end up going there quite often. But the genre scene is much smaller there than it is in
Mm.
the US and the UK. So I think it's a function of that. If it would become as prominent as US and UK, you'd then have these debates also with Australian and Canadian writers.
Mm. Now, you said you will find a conversation with contemporary global speculative fiction and its present preoccupations, climate change, the rise of the surveillance state, and
Yeah,
the deployment of artificial intelligence under conditions of capitalism. And then
yeah.
you go on. So, you want to talk about that, where the lines converge as well?
Yeah, I mean, so 2 years ago, the Clark Award, which is the main science fiction, literary award, the Arthur C. Clarke Award, out of six, not is the six shortlist of six, five were climate change novels, and the final winner, a really fantastic book called Venomous Lumpsucker, was the, was a classic, very classic climate fiction novel about the extinction of species. So this is, a major preoccupation of genre right now, and last year, or actually this year, still this year, since we're recording on December
The last few
31st,
hours.
maybe last year when this comes out, the Clark Award shortlist, at least like three of the six novels were end of the world novels, and the other three were robot novels, right? So you can see the
Hmm.
tech end of the world, really converging. And one of the novels, Adrian Tchaikovsky's book, was actually end of the world with robots, right? So I think that these are the major preoccupations that you can see in modern day global science fiction. And of course, we aren't immune from any of that. I mean, India is not immune from climate change. In fact, uh,
Yeah.
we will be badly hit by it if we are not already being badly hit by
Yeah.
it. And we have many, many problems with the inequitable deployment of AI and tech. Anil Menon's 2016 novel, Half of What I Say, is all about like, the uneven deployment of tech. So in that way, it's that many of these stories are very much in conversation with what the major preoccupations right now are of science fiction writers across the world, with, of course, like we discussed, a very distinctive Indian flavor to them. Because here the preoccupations are okay. We have stratifications around caste, religion. Of course, here many of those issues are mediated through caste, gender,
Yes.
all that. So that's the Indian flavor to them. But they are universal or global preoccupations.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, I don't know. Like you said, I think we are really at the forefront of this climate, of the
Yeah.
effects of climate change, right? So I don't know. Maybe that's why the stories are also. That's why people are not writing joyful speculative fiction. I don't know. Do you think that's a
Yeah.
possibility?
I mean, I'm not sure because I think there's always a temptation to write dystopia because we live in a very dystopic present, right? So,
Yeah,
like I think it's like hard to, for example, at least for me to have witnessed this live stream genocide for like 2 years, and then to go and write
yeah,
bubbling science fiction is it just feels a little off. So
yeah,
I can understand and I think that in some ways science fiction has always been, in fact, almost a Cassandra-esque literature, right? So
yeah,
Frankenstein is in some
yeah.
ways is
Dickens.
Cassandra, right? So
Yeah,
it's always been a bit like that, and perhaps that's just what you see in the anthology. But there is genuinely complex and thoughtful utopian writing as well around the world. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I just think it's by chance that we happen to have you know the best stories on in this round not featuring too much utopian writing. And I think the other thing is that often utopian style or adjacent writing you'll see more in fantasy or like pure fantasy, uh,
mm,
and less in on the more speculative science fictiony side.
mm,
Um, yeah, I do remember quite a few fantasy stories in submissions which were perhaps more optimistic. For whatever reason, they didn't make the final cut. I'm not saying that's because they were bad. It's just that 230 submissions, something has to be left out.
yeah,
But I think that just by its nature, speculative fiction, science fiction is more in the nature of a critique of society. So it's I think
yeah.
again, you'll find less of the outright utopianism over there. But like I said, you do have utopian science fiction, and quite good utopian SF. So it's not that people aren't writing it.
Yeah,
Maybe
but
we'll see.
while I was reading, I was just thinking that if I was to read a utopian like feel good thing,
Yeah,
I might, because of the way
yeah,
even readers now wired because of
yeah,
what's happening,
yeah,
that I might reject it because I think, what the
yeah,
hell, it's so unreal. You know
yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, the again. So I think the recent good or at least interesting utopian SF I've read, and she may object to this, but Becky Chambers' is very famous Monk and Robot series, which won a bunch of awards, uh,
Mm,
is I would say it is in a way utopian science fiction, but it's set like far in the future in a satellite of a planet where you have this half Earth socialism concept where half the world is for human habitation, the other half is completely rewilded, and the
mm.
two intersect.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's not like habitation is one, and then the habitations are interspersed amongst the wild. So it's like very much, the two are sort of like, blended together. And it's a world where effectively external conflict has been eliminated. Yeah, interesting books, but very, very far in the future. No real pathway from here to there. At least that's not their purpose. So yeah,
Hmm.
perhaps it's also the case that by its very nature, uh, presently writing utopian fiction would mean either you are in a fantasy world, which is more, fantasy, or just you have taken 3,000 years, like Ian M. Banks's culture series, right? Like, or Star
Hmm.
Trek, like years and years in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also found that story where, it's all women who are where the sea disappears.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It made me think of
Yeah.
even that was sort of like, I mean, like a feminist ideal would be like there's, where
Yeah.
women are doing everything for themselves. But this
Yeah.
is like completely,
Yeah.
it all falls in on its, caves in on
Yeah.
itself. So that
Yeah.
was also
Yeah.
interesting. Though the most affecting story I thought was the one where, I can't remember where he goes off into the other planet and, he's a healer.
Ah, yeah, yeah, yeah. We are all mayflies. I think that was.
Yeah, that's a lovely,
Yeah.
lovely
Yeah.
story.
I think that's the last short
Yeah,
story before the novelette begins.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lovely, lovely story.
Yeah.
You want to say, wait, you can't obviously pick a favorite. Like I
I
can.
mean, like, look, yeah, I enjoyed all the ones that were there in the final list. What I will say is that among the reviews that have come in, the opening story, The Last Projectionist, has
Ah,
been uniformly praised very, very highly. Um, so the opening story is something that reviewers both in India and abroad have found to be of a very, very high order. Yeah, I mean that's what
hmm.
others are saying. For me, they're all for me they're all equal.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to see that there was a consensus that that one really stood out in terms of craft and all of that.
Yeah. But that opening story also strangely made me think of Dastan going.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I think
You
that's
know?
it's definitely informed by that tradition and that culture. Uh,
Yeah, no, there is, I think, a mention of it also. But even before the mention, I thought,
yeah,
oh, like, because it's a lost art.
yeah,
And, suddenly obviously, I mean, projectionism, the
yeah,
creation like that,
yeah, yeah,
it is quite lovely.
yeah,
So, yeah, so, that's what I enjoyed about the book. It kind of like made you think, it does what like
yeah,
speculative fiction does,
yeah,
makes you think of today as well.
yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
mhm. So in your next one, I mean, are you thinking of any specific? Obviously, since the stories haven't come in yet,
yeah.
but are there any lines that you think could emerge?
I think we want broadly what we got in terms of just the diversity of the subgenres and the diversity of people submitting. I think like it worked well for us in terms of just presenting a showcase of the diversity of what's being written in India today in the speculative genre. So I would be perfectly happy with a final TOC that looks something similar to what we did in Volume One, in just in terms of distribution across subgenres in fantasy, science fiction, space opera, magical realism, spec fic, just a bit of horror. So I'd be happy with that if that was what we would end up getting for Volume Two as well.
Hmm. And finally, before I let you go, you have another life as
Yeah,
uh, like a lawyer, and
yeah,
you write serious books on the
yeah,
law, and
yeah.
and you have this side. So how do they interact, and how do you keep them apart, and do they like feed each other, that sort of thing?
I mean, I think like it obviously, and so this is what I always say. I say that whatever the day job is, is going to inform your writing, obviously, in two ways. One is that if you are an engineer and a science fiction writer, you will make sure that the specifications of your spaceship, are going to be fine. Which is why, for example, my favorite writer today, Alistair Reynolds, used to be an astrophysicist, at the European Space Agency. So the physics in his novels is spot on, and you can see that, right?
Hmm.
If you are a constitutional lawyer as your day job, you will be aware of the ways in which laws structure society, and the
Yes.
ways in which they can constrain what people can do, things like that. So you
Hmm.
will pay attention to the role that legal structures are playing in your constructed world, right? So I think that's
Hmm.
that's that's one very basic way in which your day job will impact your fiction. And the other way, of course, is that, for me, it's like fiction comes from life, right? So, and the stuff of life often happens in what you're doing in the day. So, the
Hmm.
kinds of people you meet and the kinds of issues you grapple with, and the things you do, in the course of the day will then become the stuff from which you build your fiction.
Hmm.
Uh, and so again, in that way, what you do, in the day will inform the fiction. Just for a very, small example, the my latest novel, The Sentence, is science fiction around death penalty, capital punishment, and obviously, I came to that idea or theme after many many years of engaging with the debates around death penalty in my day job. So that's the
Hmm.
way in which it happens. But I think that that's about it. So it's not that I don't write legal science fiction. I don't look for law in my editing, when I'm editing the
Hmm.
anthology. Uh,
Hmm.
I'm just, you have to write a good story. Whether it's a writer, submitting your work, or as an editor, reading work, you are looking for a good story. So I'd say that that's about it. And of course, writing nonfiction is a completely different craft to
Yeah.
writing fiction. It's like entirely different. You cannot have the same approach. You will write, and I think that one historical problem with Indian science fiction in English, or even including in other languages, in the mid 20th century, was that many writers looked upon science fiction as a vehicle for science education, right? So
Oh.
the critic T.G. Shenoy, he calls it scientific fiction, so and those are just bad stories, and that might have worked at a certain time, but now nobody has the patience for sitting through like bad fiction because it is didactic or it's meant meaning to like teach you something. So I
Hmm.
think now it's really all about the quality of the story, and that you need to follow the you need to follow the rules that make fiction good fiction. Of course, like they're not like rigid rules, but techniques and craft, right? So you have to take fiction on its own terms, not as spreading some legal message through it. So yeah.
Yeah. But do you feel like, this is when you look at, when you're putting together an anthology
Yeah.
of this sort, is it like a break for you from very serious legal work?
Not at all. I take this part of my life as importantly and as seriously as the other part, if not more.
No,
So
I just meant in terms of joy. Okay.
no, I mean I don't like I don't look at it that way, right? So
Mm.
like that's one part of life, and this is one part of life. So I don't see this as like an escape from anything. It is just like these are two parts of life that have their own place, and
Mm.
and that's the way I see it.
Okay, excellent. So that's a great note to end on. For the readers, go out and get Between Worlds, edited by Gautam Bhatia. And it's the If anthology of new Indian speculative and fantasy fiction, Volume One, and we look forward to many more volumes to come. So thank you so much, Gautam,
Thank
for
you.
talking.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.